Welcome, everyone. My name is Emily. I'm the head of growth at VoiceFlow. We are an easy way to design, prototype, and launch voice and chat experiences. And today we're doing something that's a little bit newer, where I'm going to be sitting down and interviewing someone who's been pretty near and dear to my experience with VoiceFlow since day one, Braden, the CEO, to kind of hear a little bit more about his take, the story that we've had thus far, and ultimately how he views and our team views the future of voice. And so with that, I'm super excited to introduce to you Brayden, the CEO and co-founder of VoiceFlow.
Thanks, Emily. Happy to be here. So nice to meet you.
It's definitely, I know we talk about conversations all the time, and we talk about community and having these open dialogues, but I can't say that I've had as formal of a conversation with you as we're having right now. And it'll be an interesting exercise to kind of look back on some of the conversations that we have so candidly in more of a public format, but excited nonetheless.
Yeah, likewise. So let's dig in then.
Awesome. So I know that a lot of people know VoiceFlow as is right now, where we're clearly a design tool. We're clearly trying to democratize conversation design for all. But what was your introduction to voice? What got you originally excited about this idea?
Yeah, I think so when we were kind of choosing spaces to go into. So a little bit of context. There's four co-founders for VoiceFlow, and we'd all sort of founded previous businesses, and that's actually how Emily and I met. She was actually a mentor to me at my previous company. So after that company wrapped up, it was kind of like a what's next moment, and similar to I don't want to compare us to Bezos. That's certainly not a just comparison, but he gives a good explanation on why he actually began Amazon. It was like the internet was growing at like 13,000% or something like that per year, and anything that's growing that quickly is really interesting. You should probably start a business in that space. For us, it was actually very similar to smart speakers. We saw smart speakers were the fastest growing consumer technology in history at that point. It was really reaching critical mass in the US in terms of household adoption. And so we wanted to start a company in that space. And initially it was a whole bunch of different ideas that we thought might be needed in a world where voice is ubiquitous. So it was voice commerce, it was interactive entertainment. There was a whole sort of plethora of different ideas that we pursued. And eventually we continued to go down the route of interactive stories. And as we did that, we realized the lack of tooling in the space was a real pain point for us, as we were actually building these experiences ourselves. And that led to the idea for VoiceFlow. So a bit of a roundabout answer to get there, but really it was just the such rapid adoption of voice that led us to jump into the space.
Awesome. I think one of the things that we talk a lot about, both in like the broader community of voice, but also very integral to kind of how we think about product, is this concept of community, is this concept of us being able to connect more like-minded people together, Skillshare, and ultimately rise that tide for conversation design as a whole. So in your own words, why is community important for VoiceFlow and what we're building here?
Yeah, I think community is important really for any space which has a fairly nascent component. I mean, I think you could make the argument that community is important in any space, but especially in industries that are still trying to figure out what are the golden use cases that folks can really latch onto and build livelihoods on top of. To have a community that's experimenting, there's an acceptance of failure because a lot of use cases aren't going to work at first, and ultimately a sharing of ideas is what a lot of these communities are all about. I think that's what's made the voice community fairly powerful, is everyone's experimenting with different use cases, different ideas, and then we're essentially making collective progress in terms of figuring out what works and what doesn't, and that really helps the whole space. So that's my view on voice in particular. But again, I think community is a pretty integral element of really any modern software ecosystem. It just requires a lot of iteration to get things right, and that's where community is super important.
So over the course of all of this, seeing the different customers, seeing the different community members come in and evolve, how have you seen that base evolve over the last few years, and kind of where do you predict that going overall?
Could you kind of reframe the question there? So
Mhm.
where do we see the space going, or like
Just like
uh,
the types of people that are interested in conversation design, the people
mm.
who are joining that community, like our overall customer base. How have you seen that evolved, and what are your predictions?
Yeah, I think the best way to describe it's really just more of a mainstream movement. So initially, when we first launched VoiceFlow around 2 years ago now, it was a lot of tinkerers, right? A lot of folks who came in, they're experimenting, and there weren't proven use cases yet in a lot of the areas, and so you didn't really have professional adoption yet, and you didn't really have that mainstream adoption. And now what we're starting to see is the formation of these in-house conversational AI teams at major companies, Fortune 500s, Fortune 1000s, et cetera. And so you're starting to see now that mainstream adoption where you see UX designers who've been in the UX space for the past 2-3 years now start to adopt conversation design. You've got developers who were maybe just tinkering around really start to actually make this part of their core tooling set. So I think that's really the evolution we've seen, and that's really over the past 12 months, especially with COVID, really accelerated as a lot of companies are now doing this digital transformation. In-house conversational AI teams is becoming a pretty large component of that.
Awesome. I know we talk a lot about kind of what that evolution looks like, and there's tons of people, especially even at this conference, that are kind of highlighting some of those use cases. But from your experience, kind of being on the edge, having all these conversations, what are some of the exciting use cases that you're seeing people build for?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is when it's helpful to break out conversational AI and as a platform, and then really there's two modalities that it can, or there's technically, I mean, there's many modalities, but I'd say voice, chat, and sort of mixed modality is the three I would focus on. Um, and when you look at those three modalities, for there to be a viable use case, you either have to make a business money or you have to save a business money, right? So you're either a revenue generator or a cost cutter. You're starting to see on the IVR side, modern, essentially the technology behind a lot of voice assistants, a lot of conversational AIs, like Alexa and Google Assistant, bleed into the IVR and the call center space. You're starting to see that technology come into play more and more to sort of create these modern contact center experiences. So that's obviously on the cost cutting side, right? I'd say the same thing for web chat. Almost every major website which gets a ton of volume, unless it's like a media source or something like that. If it's a business that gets a ton of volume, you go to the TELUS website or the Toyota website, you're going to see a little bubble in the bottom right corner, and that's their web chat support. And that's another place where conversational AI is actually both generating revenue in the case of automating leads, so companies like Drift, as well as cutting costs, by being able to do things like web chat support right on the site. So web chat's another great one. On the voice assistant side, it's been a lot of experimentation. I'd say mostly on the lead gen side. So how can businesses, build brand equity, through the entertainment space, as well as voice commerce. Those are kind of the two revenue generators on the voice assistants. The general platforms like Alexa and Google Assistant. So voice commerce is becoming quite big. I don't have stats off the top of my head, but from what we're seeing at VoiceFlow in terms of both interest plus. There's many reports out now, especially on VoiceBot, that just talks about the scale of purchases done through voice assistants. It's quite astounding and growing quickly. So I'd say those two sort of, as a content platform plus a monetization and purchasing platform. And then on the cost cutting side, you haven't really seen that yet on Alexa and Google, but I would not be surprised if call centers actually start to be able to take calls from those assistants. I think that would make a lot of sense. And I think in terms of other channels, we're seeing, there's a big long tail, right? Because really the industry that we're all in is the talking to people industry. And a very small sliver of that right now is being automated with conversational AI. And so, you've got any conversation that's highly programmatic, you're now starting to see conversational AI bleed its way in. So things like drive-throughs, in-car assistance, mobile banking, and then sort of the list just goes on from there in terms of any conversation that you have repetitively more than 10 times a day, with customers, that's very structured is now being automated. So it's a really exciting time to be in conversational AI, and I could probably go on all day about some of the use cases that we're seeing.
So I think like you highlighted, I know like there's a lot of conversation around how voice and conversation design have picked up more reins around accessibility, more opportunities for people to potentially think about emerging states of what UX looks like when we re-enter the world post-pandemic. But kind of looking at the broader picture there, what are some of those trends that you may predict will continue, are at risk of falling off, or you really see picking up steam? Where should conversation designers that may be in this audience right now might want to spend their time thinking about if they want to be on that next wave?
Yeah, it's probably multimodality because when you look at now this is voice interfaces in particular, but when you look at voice interfaces, they have very fast input speed and a very slow output speed when it comes to data. Multimodality fixes that problem where you have this really high output speed modality of visual and the really fast voice input speed. So pairing those two together creates a really seamless user experience. And a lot of conversation designers, they come from copywriting backgrounds. Some come from UX backgrounds. And I think it's important to understand how visuals play with conversation design to actually design for conversation first and then layer on modality versus a lot of visual designers, if they actually come in and they try to implement a voice interface, they're going visual first. They're doing the visuals, and they're essentially viewing voice as a navigation system rather than more of an OS. So I'd say, yeah, that's probably the number one field I'd sort of encourage conversation designers to think about is not just the copy, not just good prompt design, being able to design for context, but also being able to design for different modalities as well, both voice only, chat only, and multimodal as well.
Awesome. I think one of the things that I know we see in the community, we see when we're talking to teams, things like that, is that there's these different makeups, there's these different workflows, these different people and teams all around the world that are trying to figure out what does this workflow look like? How does conversation design look like at scale? From some of the predictions that you've had in terms of use cases or working with these companies, what does the makeup or the future of a conversation design team look like to you?
Yeah, I mean, it depends on the use case. I'd say, just broadly speaking, the conversation designers really, they're almost like conversation architects. So depending on how big the team is, right? So if you're a very small conversation design team, the conversation designer is like the QA tester, the PM, and the copywriter, and the conversation designer all in one, right? It's a very multifaceted role. As teams get bigger, like let's say you have a 15-person team or a 100-person team, and in the case of some companies now, there are legitimately like 1,000-person plus conversational AI teams. You start to see the sophistication of sort of the modularity of these roles, and so you'll see conversation designers where, again, they're architecting the high-level flows. They're figuring out what intents need to be there and what don't need to be there. You'll actually see AI trainers who are purely responsible for managing the intents, managing the utterances, making sure that everything plays nicely with the NLP, NLU. You'll have copywriters where they're specifically writing prompts and responses. And then, you've got your legal, your marketing, you've got conversational PMs. Sometimes you have visual designers in the mix. All of these roles that would often be done by, if it's a smaller team, by a single person, start to really branch out so that people can specialize and really try to create world-class experiences. So I'd say, I'm probably forgetting a role or two, but I'd say those are sort of the main ones we see, where the conversation designer is the architect, essentially, of the whole UX. You've got, whether it's called data scientists or AI trainers is another term we've heard. Folks who are working specifically to make sure that we have the best understanding of the user, we have the best trained NLP, NLU. And then you have copywriters, and then you have sort of the PM, the visual designer, and of course the developers as well. So, roughly like a 6 to 7-person team makeup.
Great. I think one of the things that you spoke about there is that there is so many different perspectives, different teams, different team members that really kind of come together when thinking about architecting conversation design. So one of the things that we talk a lot about from a product is this democratization, is this opportunity to kind of level the playing field and allow a lot of different perspectives to come in and build on this design platform or this design interface. So I know we talk internally a lot about interface shifts and why that's important for tools to really go in there and help empower those new creators. But how do you think about no code democratization or just the roles that designers and developers play in creating this new interface and popularizing it? I know that you have a lot of thoughts on what that looks like from our tool side, but curious to kind of hear those more specifically on how the no code side really comes into play.
Totally. I think there's really two types of no-code tools, and I think this doesn't get talked about enough. Um, so one type of no-code tool, the problem that they solve is that you cannot code, right? Like it is no code out of necessity. The other sort of type of no-code tool is not that you cannot code; it's that it is an abstraction layer. It is sort of the lowest common denominator that enables collaboration between designers and developers, and it otherwise works on top of your of your code, right? So it's almost like like a custom GUI tool, but for your stack. And so you still have access to the underlying code. You can still set up custom NLPs. You can still set up custom dialogue managers. You simply have sort of a manipulation layer on top. And so these are the sort of the two types of no code tools. And I think just to put tangible examples behind it, one would be a Wix. You cannot code. It's super templated. You don't control the underlying code. You host on them, but it makes it really easy to set up a website if you don't know how to code. The other would be something like a Webflow, where it is a very, not complicated, but a very sophisticated GUI interface that allows you to still have access to the underlying stack. You can still export the JavaScript, the HTML, the CSS. And so that actually attracts a more technical audience where teams that would normally custom code feel more comfortable because they're not being locked in. They're simply using a visual tool, which is able to streamline the creation of this type of interface. So when we think about no code as it relates to conversational AI, what we're trying to do at VoiceFlow is be in that sort of the latter category where we're not trying to be for teams that cannot code. We are trying to be a democratizing layer within organizations where by offering a visual layer on top of your custom stack and still allowing you to have access to that custom stack, we're making it faster and easier for people who even developers being able to quickly create dialogues that would have otherwise taken them a few weeks, being able to whip that up in VoiceFlow, being able to enable designers to go and prototype without having to ship to production or wait for engineering to pass off a prototype that engineering didn't really want to make anyways. And so we view ourselves in that category, sort of this, the second gen of no code tools, where it's not about the inability to code. It's not about dumbing it down. It's about making it faster and ultimately democratizing access within the organization to create custom coded projects just using a visual interface.
Awesome. I think like zooming out and kind of thinking about what we're building for the future, because in a lot of these cases, like building tools like this is great because it solves immediate problems for companies or individuals who are looking to get into the space. But broadly speaking, it's really to help shape the future of what this interface looks like. So, in your own words, what goals do you foresee the company or even yourself have on, let's say, impacting this technology space or impacting voice in the future?
Yeah, I think our goal at VoiceFlow is to, long term, we'll have succeeded if we've essentially democratized conversational AI. So making it a technology that any business or individual can design, amazing experiences that are, as high fidelity as what you'd find in the best Fortune 500s, and being able to deploy that across any channel. Because right now, you really only have this amazing technology finding its way into the largest organizations because it's really expensive. You have to go through a ton of different vendors to get your NLP, your TTS, your ASR. You have to have sophisticated dialogue managers, a ton of data. And so we think that by working with vendors across the stack and essentially being a unifying framework that is visual so that you don't need to have engineering resources always on hand, we'll be able to enable this technology to be accessed by a much wider audience. So that's our goal. There's certainly a bunch of steps to get there, but I think we're making progress in the right direction.
And I think, like, speaking of progress, we've seen a ton, whether it's just even looking and isolating the last few years, in COVID, kind of pushing the entire industry forward, but also just in general. What are some of the exciting things that you think about for voice and conversation design in the next 5, 10, or even 50 years now that things are looking a lot clearer on what's possible?
Yeah, I think the automated dialogue managers are really exciting. So some of the things like Alexa conversations or Raza stories, that's really exciting stuff. I think there's been I would hope that what we start to see now, this is less of a prediction, more of a hope. I would hope we start to see more intent-based queries for the actual, like the general assistants, like the Alexas, the Googles of the world, where I'm no longer asking, like knowledge-based queries, like, hey, how tall is the Eiffel Tower? It's, hey, I'm hungry, right? It's more of an intention. And when we start to see that consumer behavior shift, and there's a bit of a chicken and egg around this, but let's just assume we're in a perfect world for a second. When you see that consumer-based shift where it's, I'm hungry, or where's the nearest restaurant is another way to say I'm hungry, right? You're implicitly saying that. You're going to start to see these assistants act more and more like search engines, which is just really, really exciting, because I think that's when we can start to view our assistants as the reason why they're called assistants, right? They're meant to be helpful and be able to help us in our everyday tasks, not just voice, search of Google, because that's often what a lot of assistants are for most folks. It's weather, alarm clocks, and then the ability to search for information. We want to actually be able to access, manipulate, and engage with information, right? I think we'll definitely see that in the next 5 years. Like 10 years is like with extreme certainty. 2 years is a little bit, it's plausible, and then 5 years, I feel pretty confident that you'll start to see the voice assistants that we all know and use today really become search engines, and allowing us to access the world around, access information and access services around us, really with the use of a personal assistant, like almost like a concierge that we all have in our home.
I think one of the things that we talk a lot about, and even when you talk about describing the assistant, its purpose, its language that it uses, a lot of conversation time focuses on bringing linguistics to the forefront and kind of that conversation type, really, really helping to shape what that experience looks like. But the other side of it's also user experience. How do all of these elements play in together? How do they create more of a seamless approach with multimodalities? But also, how are they impacting or changing what's possible for users? So in that case, zooming in on UX, what are some shifts that you're seeing there that are exciting or that people should keep an eye out for?
Could you reframe the question a bit? So,
Mhm.
okay,
So
go ahead.
in terms of UX, there's a lot of opportunities with each new modality, each new interface to make an impact.
Yeah.
And we know, for instance, with mobile, there's notifications that will work historically better there versus desktop, which is more visually appealing. So for voice and conversation design, what are some UX trends or things that you think are going to be either challenged or opened up with with voice or conversation design?
Yeah, I mean, immediately it comes to, I think there's really two. There's going to be the localization, and then there's going to be multimodality. And there's a whole bucket of things that need to be addressed and worked on. But especially when it comes to multimodality, it's because like I've got like a visual interface. I was going to pull up my iPad here. I've got an iPad right here, and Apple knows that when I'm using the iPad, I am always looking at the screen, right? Like otherwise, I just can't really use it. With conversational AI, I could be looking at the screen, I could be touching the screen, or I could be halfway across the room, and I could, just be talking. And so it's being able to dynamically adjust the modality based off of the what would provide the best user experience, right? So there's really kind of three states. I might, let's take Uber, or actually let's take some retail experience as an example. If there's a purchase that I want to make, something that's very routine, like maybe I want to buy milk, right? Because I'm out of milk, I open up my fridge, I'm like, oh no. I could be like, hey, voice assistant, buy milk across the room, totally fine, routine purchase. It should be able to go through. There's gonna be other times where I'm on, maybe the streetcar home from work, in a day, back in the day when we actually used to go into offices. And I'm on my phone and I don't want people to know what I'm going to be purchasing. And so I'm only going to be using my mobile app with just touch, sort of the same experience we would have today. And then, the third example is going to be where I'm on my phone, but maybe I'm in the comfort of my home, I'm on my couch or something, and it is faster to search by asking and then complete the purchase and complete some of the final details through touch. And so being able to manage these three different scenarios where it's voice only, multimodality, as well as visual only. And I think you're going to see that there are many apps which would benefit from having this kind of multimodality paradigm for UX, but it's really hard to implement because if you just have, if you tack on voice interfaces as an afterthought, it can be tough to do it well because it's more just navigation than anything else. So yeah, I think that's going to be a challenge. And then the other is just internationalization and localization. So, you might have let's take a drive-through as an example. You might have a drive-through on the West Coast, which has a very different demeanor and, way of communicating than the East Coast. And, that's nationally. You could even go down to even just, the Bronx versus Queens versus, other places in New York. Like, you might even want to get down to that level of localization, right? For not let alone different cultures and continents and countries and things like that. So there's a lot of challenges. I don't think we're there yet. I think most people are just on the do I have a voice experience or not spectrum of things. But I'd imagine as the market gets more saturated, that's typically when you start to see experiences compete with each other for quality of design, and that's when you're going to start to see some localization come into play, and it'll be interesting to see.
Definitely. I think like the beauty of conversation design is that it is inherently human as much as it is powered by AI, as much as it is architected or designed. So I think there are definitely some really great examples of people who have done best in class user experience research there or have localized. So I guess kind of just to kind of close things off and bookend, what would be some advice that you have for people who are interested in the space, who are in the audience, whether they're individuals or teams that are interested in getting started in the space? What would be your piece of advice to kind of kickstart that progress?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely sign up for VoiceFlow and start tinkering around. That's my number one piece of advice. I'm a little biased, but that's the advice. I'd say number two is really. I mean, two falls in that same vein, right? Like, I'm biased saying sign up for VoiceFlow, but I think it's just tinkering and trying to understand the space and understand how all the tech plays together, and what's possible, what's not possible. And I think from there, once you understand, what is possible, what is not possible, what is easy, what is not easy to do, you can start to look for different use cases. Best example I'd give is, we started as a children's story company, and now we're VoiceFlow, right? And we only landed on sort of what we're doing today because we started to tinker around and experiment with different ideas. And so that's what I'd recommend to folks, whether you're a designer, developer, PM, or just someone who's interested in the space, start playing with different ideas and really understand what the capabilities are, and you can kind of go from there.
Great. Well, thank you so much for sitting down and doing this interview. But
Totally.
more importantly, for everyone in the audience, if you have any questions, if there's anything that you're curious to hear about, or even if you haven't already had an opportunity to jump into the conversation in our community, don't hesitate to write us in the Q&A and Voice Global, or jump into the conversation on Facebook. Thanks again, everybody, for joining.
Thanks, everyone.